The Venator-class Star Destroyer is supposed to be older than the Imperial-class. In the Star Wars timeline, its predecessor technology, already being phased out by 19 BBY, replaced by its larger, supposedly more capable successor. The Imperial-class stretches 1,600 meters. The Venator is only 1,137 meters. Older, smaller, an antique of a bygone republic. So why does the Venator look like concept art from a tech company's design sprint, while the Imperial looks like it was built in a garage in Van Nuys, California? Because one of them basically was. The Venator was designed in 2002 and 2005. The Imperial was designed in 1974 and 1977. The same franchise, the same fictional ship lineage, separated by 28 years of real-world production history, and every single one of those years shows up on the hull. That's the crack at the center of Star Wars visual continuity. Canon has to work around the fact that its older ships look newer, because older ships were drawn later. The further back you go in the fictional timeline, the more sophisticated the real-world production era that created it. And no amount of lore patchwork fully papers that over. Here's how it happened. In 1974, a man named Colin Cantwell sat down with George Lucas to sketch the opening shot of a movie that hadn't been filmed yet. Cantwell wasn't a typical Hollywood concept artist. He'd worked on special photographic effects for Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Before that, he'd helped cover the Apollo 11 moon landing for NASA and CBS. The man had a background that ran from lunar orbit to science fiction cinema, and in 1974, he started drawing what would become the Imperial Star Destroyer. His original concept was something he called a Sith carrier, a triangular warship that would launch fighters and use radar dish arrays as weapons. Lucas refined the brief. Joe Johnston served as ILM's visual effects art director and helped push the ships toward their final forms. And by 1977, what emerged was a wedge-shaped gray object defined entirely by what was physically possible to build in a converted warehouse on the edge of Los Angeles. The ILM model shop didn't have computers. They had their hands, which meant the Imperial Star Destroyer had to be fabricated from physical materials at physical scale. Every geometric curve or organic surface feature that looked cool in a sketch became a fabrication problem in the real world. Complex flowing shapes cost money and time. Angular, blocky geometry was achievable. So that's what the Empire's most iconic warship became, a gray triangle with a superstructure bolted to its spine. And the detail work, the reason the surface looks alive rather than like a plastic toy, came from a technique called greebling. The ILM model makers bought roomfuls of plastic model kits, cars, planes, tanks. They stripped the components off those kits and glued them directly to the hull. The resulting texture wasn't designed exactly. It was assembled, cannibalized from whatever small fiddly plastic pieces existed in 1976. The Star Destroyer's surface is a collage of found objects, because found objects were faster and cheaper than custom fabrication. That chaos reads as industrial complexity. It works, but it's unmistakably the texture of something built by human hands in the 1970s. Now hold that image in your head, because in 2002, Ryan Church sat down at a computer as concept design supervisor for Attack of the Clones and began drawing ships for a republic that had never existed before. By 2003, he was sketching early concepts for a vessel originally called the Jedi Cruiser, which would eventually become the Venator. The constraints he worked under were nearly the inverse of the ones that shaped the Imperial Star Destroyer. In a digital pipeline, any shape is buildable. Organic curves that would have cost ILM days of custom fabrication took minutes in software. Smooth hull geometry was no harder to render than blocky geometry. Surface complexity wasn't a cost item at the construction stage, the way it had been in a physical model shop. And rather than scavenging texture from plastic model kits, Church and the prequel design team could art direct every surface decision with complete freedom. What came out of that freedom looks like what it is: Ships designed by skilled people in 2002 and 2005, using state-of-the-art digital tools, working in an era when film design had absorbed 25 years of science fiction visual language that didn't exist when Lucas made A New Hope. The Venator got a double-wedge silhouette with sweeping hull curves. It got a red and brown color scheme that the Wikipedia entry on Star Destroyers notes was deliberately introduced to represent the Republic. Rich, aesthetically considered, visually expressive. By the end of Revenge of the Sith, as the Republic collapses into the Empire, the Venators on screen shed that red coloration and go gray. It's genuinely elegant visual storytelling. It's also the tell. The red-striped ship looks more advanced than its supposed successor because it was designed by a concept artist with a modern digital toolkit 28 years after the successor was fabricated by hand from model kit parts. The in-universe explanation for this is that the Venator was specifically designed to bridge the appearance of the Acclamator-class from Attack of the Clones and the Imperial-class from the original trilogy. Which is worth unpacking, because what that sentence actually means is the 2005 film deliberately tried to visually connect itself to a 1977 film, and the acknowledged vehicle for doing that was the Venator. The bridging ship is itself the admission that a gap needed bridging. The problem doesn't stop at the Venator and Imperial comparison. It runs through the entire franchise timeline because it's a structural feature, not an accident. The Acclamator-class assault ship, introduced in Attack of the Clones in 2002, looks exactly like what it is, a massive, angular capital ship conceived in the early 2000s digital pipeline, complex armament arrays integrated into a design that could only exist as software geometry. Ryan Church's concept art for the Acclamators has that characteristic early 2000s CGI quality, dense, elaborate, assured in its own visual sophistication. The Victory-class Star Destroyer is set in the same in-universe era. Both the Acclamator and the Victory-class were contemporaries during the Clone Wars. But the Victory-class was first mentioned in West End Games' Star Wars sourcebooks back in 1989, and the artists who illustrated it were drawing from the only visual Star Wars reference that existed, the original trilogy. So the Victory-class, on paper and in early game materials, looks like an OT ship, because it was drawn by people who had only ever seen OT ships. Its silhouette belongs to the 1980s EU aesthetic vocabulary. Its supposed contemporary, the Acclamator, belongs to 2002 CGI. Two ships from the same fictional moment in history, separated by a decade of real-world design, and it shows. This is the systemic nature of the problem. Every time the franchise produces new material set in an earlier era, it brings the design vocabulary of its current production year with it. And that vocabulary is always more sophisticated than whatever existed when the original trilogy ships were drawn. Let's talk about the cockpit. One of the most disorienting moments in the Star Wars prequel experience is sitting down in a Republic ship's bridge and looking at the consoles. Clean panels, smooth surfaces, holographic displays, touchscreen interfaces. Everything gleams with a frictionless digital sheen. Then you cut to the original trilogy, and you're looking at, I want to describe this correctly, a 1970s hi-fi setup trying to pass as the command center of a galaxy-spanning warship. Toggle switches, backlit rocker buttons, physical keyboards with actual keys that physically press down, analog readouts. The Millennium Falcon's cockpit, one of the most beloved interiors in cinema history, is a masterpiece of found object production design assembled by ILM's set decorator Roger Christian from whatever surplus switches, gauges, and instrument panels could be sourced in 1976. The Force Awakens production team, decades later, specifically researched this. The Blu-ray special features for the 2015 film include a discussion about the original Falcon's switches and their real-world origins, because the production was deliberately trying to recreate that aesthetic and needed to understand exactly what they were looking at. Toggle switches that became shorthand for the future in 1977 are, from a 2005 perspective, just toggle switches. And from a 2025 perspective, they are charming artifacts of a specific production era that you can date on site. This is what George Lucas called the used future, a deliberate design philosophy in which the world of Star Wars should look lived in, worn, functional rather than pristine. The used future aesthetic is why OT ships look the way they do. But the used future philosophy was applied using the materials available in 1976. And those materials are toggle switches and plastic model kit components and surplus aircraft hardware. The result looks exactly like the 1970s because it was built from things that existed in the 1970s. Doug Chiang, who led art design for the prequel trilogy and articulated 4 principles for Star Wars design: strong silhouette, the 3-second rule, personality, and believability, was working under a Lucas mandate that design should never stand out or feel art-directed. The design should blend and appear real. But appearing real in 2002 means something categorically different from appearing real in 1977. Reality itself got more sophisticated. The franchise eventually became aware of this and tried to fix it. The fix is instructive. For The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, ILM model maker Lorne Peterson built a proof of concept for Darth Vader's new flagship. The executor was represented in production by a physical model over 9 feet long. Peterson constructed it by hand, and the resulting model is still one of the most visually menacing ships in the franchise. 45 years later, the executor's first appearance above Hoth still lands. The practical model era produced something that neither time nor polygon count has meaningfully improved on. When J.J. Abrams began production on The Force Awakens in 2013, he and his production designers Rick Carter and Darren Gilford set out explicitly to recreate that quality. Darren Gilford, whose previous credits included Tron Legacy and Oblivion, gave interviews specifically framed around maintaining visual continuity with the original trilogy. Rick Carter, a 2-time Oscar winner, joined him in that mandate. Abrams went so far as to shoot on Panavision cameras using vintage Kodak film stock, an analog filmmaking choice made deliberately on a 2015 blockbuster, explicitly to impose period-appropriate aesthetic properties on a digital production. Concept artist James Klein and the team at ILM designed the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer, the Finalizer, as the First Order's primary capital ship. It's angular. It has an exposed bridge tower. It evokes the Imperial-class clearly. By almost any measure, it succeeds at what it was trying to do. But here's the question that genuinely doesn't have a clean answer. Does it look like a 1977 ship? Or does it look like a 2015 recreation of what a 1977 ship should look like? Some fans find it indistinguishable from the original. Others notice something slightly too polished, slightly too deliberate, in the same way that a brand new building designed to look Victorian has a quality that actual Victorian buildings don't. The seam shows. Not badly, but it's there. What Abrams was attempting with the Kodak stock and the practical sets and the Resurgent's angular geometry was a real-world answer to the same problem the lore team was patching with in-universe explanations. Both were wrestling with the same crack. The crack being, the franchise's fictional timeline runs in one direction, and the real-world production eras that created its ships run in an entirely different direction. Lore can't fix that. Production design choices can mitigate it, but they can't fully close it. The in-universe justifications for the visual regression are genuinely creative. The most common is that the Republic was a wealthy, aesthetically minded civilization that built ships reflecting its prosperity. Refined, visually considered designs for a prosperous, democratic order. The Empire, by contrast, made a deliberate choice to project power through intimidation rather than elegance. utilitarian gray, stripped-back surfaces, the oppressive functionality of fascist architecture. It's a coherent explanation, and it works on its own terms. What it doesn't explain is why the Empire's utilitarian gray happens to correspond exactly to what 1970s model-making constraints and budget limitations produced, while the Republic's refined elegance corresponds exactly to what 2002 digital design pipelines enabled. The lore and the production history are perfectly aligned, which is either an enormous coincidence or a retroactive rationalization. The answer is pretty clearly the latter, arrived at by smart people working on a difficult continuity problem. It holds together, but it's also, unmistakably, a patch applied from the outside. The wildest version of this problem arrived in 2017 with the mega-class Star Dreadnought Supremacy, Snoke's flagship in The Last Jedi. 60-kilometer wingspan, 13 kilometers in length. It's a flat flying wing, roughly H-shaped, proportioned like something that lost an argument with a geometry textbook. In the fan community, there had been running jokes for decades about Star Wars escalating capital ship sizes, each new entry bigger than the last, the joke being that eventually someone would just build a ship the size of a planet and call it a super-duper Star Destroyer. The Supremacy is 60 kilometers wide. The joke became canon. The production history of the sequel trilogy is its own subject, but the Supremacy illustrates the outer limit of the problem. A design so large it tips from menacing into parody, partly because no visual context can make a 60-kilometer wing feel visceral the way a physical model under motion control photography can. You now have everything you need to watch any Star Wars ship scene and tell, within about 3 seconds, what real-world decade produced it. Smooth hole geometry, organic curves, red or gold color accents, visible detail complexity that somehow looks frictionless. You're watching a 2002 to 2005 design. Blocky angular silhouette, uniform gray, surface texture that looks assembled rather than sculpted, an exposed bridge tower perched on top like someone bolted a greenhouse to a wedge. That's a 1977 to 1980 ship. If it has toggle switches on the bridge consoles, if the cockpit looks like someone raided an aircraft salvage yard, you're looking at something built when physical materials were the only materials available. And if the ship is angular and gray and deliberately evokes the original trilogy, but has a quality that feels slightly too considered, slightly too aware of itself as a reference, that's 2015. That's Abrams and Guilford and Carter working hard to make 2015 look like 1977, and mostly succeeding, which is itself a kind of achievement. Colin Cantwell, the man who drew the original Star Destroyer in 1974, had worked on the Apollo moon landing broadcast before he ever picked up a pencil for George Lucas. He died in 2022, and the franchise named a ship after him in the Andor series, the Cantwell-class Arrestor cruiser, derived from his original Sith carrier concept. His design vocabulary, born from physical fabrication constraints and a 1970s aesthetic, became the baseline that every subsequent Star Wars production has either worked within or worked against. The Venator looks more advanced than the Imperial Star Destroyer because the people who designed it were working with better tools. That's not a failure of the franchise. It's how film production works. What makes it interesting is that the gap is readable, that you can look at a ship and see not just what it is, but when it was made, and by whom, and under what constraints. The hull plating carries production history the way tree rings carry weather. Every ship in Star Wars is an artifact from two timelines simultaneously, the fictional one and the real one. That's not a crack in the franchise. That's accidental archaeology. Subscribe for more stories like this.